Hey there, thanks for tuning in to another edition of NAOBC's Live C Groups. And so today we are going to cover the last chapter in Styles' book, Evangelism. We've been going through the book for several weeks now, and today we've come to the final chapter. So we'll cover that chapter this week. Next week, we're going to do just a recap of the whole book, similar to what we did with the Case for Christ, where we'll try to get a feel for the book as a whole and just have a helpful review of what we've covered. The week after that, we're going to transition to something a little different with our midweek's time, and I'll have more details for you all about that when we get there. But for now, let's turn our attention to Styles' last chapter of the book Evangelism. And this book gets into the real practical nitty gritty of doing evangelism. So, everything that's happened before, all the chapters we've looked at so far, we're kind of just laying a groundwork and a foundation for getting to the actual act of evangelism, making sure we had a good basis built up before we got into the practical application. And now that that's been set, now that that's in place, Styles is ready to launch into what are some ways we can think about and behave with respect to evangelism that are helpful, that help us to do the act and the discipline of evangelism. And here, Styles invites us to think, along with the Apostle Paul, of evangelism as being ambassadors. And so read with me in 2 Corinthians 5, verses 20 and 21. Therefore, we are ambassadors for Christ, since God is making his appeal through us. We plead on Christ's behalf. Be reconciled to God. He made the one who did not know sin to be sin for us, so that in him we might become the righteousness of God. Now, first off, let's just have a quick refresher on what an ambassador is and does. So when you've got two nations that want to communicate with each other, it's often helpful to take one representative of this nation and have them go and live and interact with the leadership of this nation, so that when that representative speaks, he speaks on behalf of the nation he comes from, and he hears and interacts with the government on behalf of his own. And that's really what an ambassador is in general. And what Paul is saying in this passage is that in many ways, Christians are like ambassadors. And we're like ambassadors in this respect, that we belong to a different kingdom. We belong to the kingdom of God. And yet we live in this world at this time, which is the kingdom of the world. And we're told in the Bible that the kingdom of the world is in opposition to the kingdom of God, because the kingdom of God is under God's rule and the kingdom of the world resists God's rule. So we are, in that sense, representatives of the kingdom of God to the world around us. The second way we're like ambassadors, and Paul picks up on this in this passage as well, is that ambassadors are kind of like relay stations when two governments, two kingdoms are talking. That is, an ambassador doesn't just get to say and do whatever they want. An ambassador is given a message from their government, their kingdom, and they're told to express that message to the kingdom and the government that they're a part of, or they're living in as a representative. And the same thing has happened with us as ambassadors of the kingdom of God here in the kingdom of the world. We have a message, and that message is that because of Jesus, God is willing to be reconciled to sinful people. And like good ambassadors, our job is to declare that message to citizens of the world, to the lost people that stand outside of Christ. And that just is what evangelism is. Evangelism is us taking the message we've received as ambassadors and declaring it to God's enemies, to letting them know that he's willing to be reconciled. And Stiles picks up on that idea of Christians as ambassadors. And he starts to unpack it in some practical and helpful ways. And in particular, he's got 4 ways that he unpacks it, 4 aspects of being an ambassador. And so now, with the time we've got left, I'm just going to walk us through all 4 of those aspects of being an ambassador, and that'll conclude our time together. So, number 1, a good ambassador thinks through conversations. That is, if you're the ambassador on behalf of a nation or kingdom to another nation or kingdom, you don't walk into meetings and conversations with members and representatives of the kingdom that you are living among and just go cold turkey, just say whatever comes to mind. No, you're thoughtful. You do research, you think through things, you plan what you're going to say. And Stiles, speaking as someone with a lot of experience as an effective evangelist, is saying that one of the marks of a good evangelist/ambassador is you take the time to think through what it is you're going to say to your lost friends. And I think this is helpful, that if you want to be really intentional about evangelizing a lost friend around you, or family member around you, or neighbor, or somebody you go to school with, or a coworker if some of you are working, it is a good practice to just take a few minutes before you encounter them and think through, what is the one thing you want to say to them? What would you say based on where you guys are at in your relationship, and based on conversations you've had so far? And just to give you an example of this, I worked one time with a particular individual at a bookkeeping firm that I was a part of before I became a pastor. And one of the things I would do with this individual is we were in charge of doing the route together for a time. And all that meant is we would have to drive to different clients and do some paperwork exchanges and take care of things for them and things like that. And I recall I came to the conviction that I needed to do something to share the gospel with this person. And so I started to think through what could be a way for me to launch into that conversation. And what I came up with, for better or worse, was to ask the person if they had ever gone to church growing up. And so we got into the car one day, we got along on the route, and then just at a certain lull in the conversation, I brought that up. And to be honest, it was much more effective than I thought it would be. Just to ask them, did they ever grow up going to church, and what was that like for them? That ended up opening up a great conversation. And I will tell you, I am not a good enough evangelist or a fast enough thinker on my feet to have come up with something that simple right on the spot. It happened because I thought about it beforehand. And while I don't do that all the time, I think Stiles is right, and I commend to you to just take some time and think through what it is you're going to say. And I would encourage you as well to think small, to not feel like you need to say absolutely all the truth in the Bible in any one encounter, but to think through what's the next question you could ask, or a next step, a next thing you could say, or the next thing you could invite them to that's going on at the church. So that's step 1. A good ambassador thinks through conversations. Number 2, a good ambassador is bold and clear. In Ephesians 6:9, Paul says this: "Pray for me, that the message may be given to me when I open my mouth to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel." You know, Paul wrote that while he was in prison. And there in prison, he was praying for boldness, to not be afraid to speak out on behalf of Christ, not be afraid to declare the truth of the gospel, this message we've been given that God is willing to be reconciled even to his captors and fellow inmates. And I would commend to you that the heart of boldness is simply the willingness to act. That what it means to be bold simply means that even if you're scared, even if you're hesitant, even if you don't do evangelism perfectly right, you are still willing to take the next step in reaching that person for the gospel. Number 3, a good ambassador delivers the message and trusts Jesus for the response. This is something we've talked about several times during the course of this lesson, and I think it bears repeating. That our job as Christians, our job as ambassadors and evangelists, is simply to deliver the message our King has given us. This message that God is willing to be reconciled to sinful people. And what happens after that is really up to the Lord. It's between that individual and the Lord. In the same way that when the ambassador of the U.S. to Russia or Ukraine or China delivers to that government a message from the president, it is not the responsibility of the ambassador to worry about how that government is going to respond and react. The responsibility of that ambassador is to deliver faithfully the message they've been given by their leader, the president, and to trust that the president is going to take care of the repercussions. And likewise, when we do evangelism, we hope people will be saved. But ultimately, the only piece of that we're in charge of is declaring faithfully the message and trusting Jesus to know best what to do with their response. Number 4, and our final one, a good ambassador does not lose heart. It is a helpful reminder to know and remember that Jesus has already won the victory over sin in this world. In other words, the kingdom of the world that we live in now, this world ruled in some respects by sin and given over to rebellion against God, Jesus has already defeated this world. And what's happening now is Jesus has extended this period of grace where he says to an enemy nation, any of you who is willing to come to me and be reconciled, to enter into my kingdom and forsake yours, anyone who's willing to change sides here and now, I'm ready to be reconciled. It's a moment of grace before Jesus comes again and deals the final blow to this world and makes a new world, a world without sin and without rebellion, a world where his rulership over all things is manifest and clear. It's good to remember that because it's a reminder that no matter how much we're scared, no matter how often we feel like we fail, in the end, Jesus has already won the victory. So that's 4 aspects of being a good ambassador and evangelist. I hope it was as helpful for you as it was for me, and I do look forward to seeing you all in our C groups this week. Thanks.